welcome to Elizabeth Reads. Today we are reading A Place Called Perfect, and we are on chapter 13, The Watchers. Boy grabbed Violet's hand and raced down the narrow cobbled lane back onto Forgotten Road towards the stone arch. Darkness was leaking from the sky as they climbed the steps through the arch and up towards the door. The gatekeeper, in her tight purple dress, looked like an overgrown grape as she bent over packing up her bag. The large iron key hung in the lock. Boy whispered to Violet to hide in the shadow of the wall. "I'll distract her while you get out, then wait for me at the top of Rag Lane." Violet was about to protest when Boy left her side and approached the woman. "Did you hear about the trouble in the market, Mrs. Snout?" Boy said, walking towards the door. The woman looked up at him. "Oh, Boy, I was wondering who it was talking. Shouldn't you be going back to the orphanage soon?" "I was just passing and thought I'd call up. I know you get lonely on the door sometimes." "Aren't you one in a million, Boy?" A gap-toothed smile stretched across Mrs. Snout's rosy cheeks. "I'm always saying it. You're the best of the orphans, poor creatures, the lot of you. Now, what did you say about trouble?" Boy stood facing Violet so that Mrs. Snout had her back to the door and began to tell a tale of trouble that Violet hadn't witnessed at all that night. The woman was engrossed, and her oohs and ahs of astonishment and delight echoed down the lane as the story unfolded. Boy glanced over Mrs. Snout's shoulder at Violet and gestured for her to move to the door. Violet hesitated for a minute. Boy's eyes were now moving wildly side to side, ushering her towards the large wooden door. "Are you okay, Boy? Is there something wrong with your eyes?" Mrs. Snout asked. "Oh, I think something flew into one," Boy said, trying to cover over his strange expressions. "Let me take a look." Mrs. Snout moved closer to Boy and grabbed both sides of his head with her large lumps of hands. Violet pushed fear to the back of her mind and tiptoed to the lock. Slowly, she turned the key until it clicked, and then she pulled on the huge iron handle. At first, the door didn't move, and Violet began to panic. She looked over at Boy and Mrs. Snout. The woman was now bent over her friend, ogling his eyeballs. Violet leaned all her weight back on the handle and pulled again. This time, the solid door moved just enough for her to squeeze through. Once on the other side, she pulled it shut and ran along the shadows of Rag Lane until she reached the top where it met Archer's Avenue. There she stopped and waited. And waited. It seemed like an eternity before Boy appeared from the bottom of the avenue, his eyes bloodshot. "Where have you been?" Violet said, her voice squeaking a little in panic. "She almost pulled my eye out," he panted, bending over to catch his breath. "She said she couldn't find anything. She gave it a good look, though." Violet tried not to laugh. "How did you get past her, anyway?" she asked, hiding her smile. "You're not coming from the direction of the gate." She indicated behind him along Archer's Avenue. "I told you, I don't usually go that way," he winked. Boy didn't offer any further explanation as she waited for him to catch his breath. Once ready, he signaled for Violet to stay put and peered round the corner of Archer's Avenue up at the tower. Putting his fingers to his lips, he beckoned her forward. "You have to be quiet," he whispered. "Some watchers patrol Perfect at night. There's not many of them, but they're around the streets. I've even caught them going into people's houses, though I've never gotten close enough to see what they were doing." The thought of the watchers in her house gave Violet the creeps. She tiptoed after her new friend, her heart thumping. As quietly as they could, they slipped through the early dawn shadows of Edward Street. All was still, and she relaxed a little. They were just approaching the Archer's Emporium when Boy pulled her into a doorway. "Blasted early mornings," a gruff voice said. "He's always late. Expects me to be waiting around for him." Violet peered round the corner. "That's Fists. He's the head watcher," Boy whispered. A large man paced back and forth outside the front door of the brothers' shop. He blew air into his giant cupped hands to warm them against the morning chill. He was about the same height as Violet's dad, but squared like a cement block. His muscles were so big they almost burst through his clothes. He wore dark navy from the tip of his toes to the top of his head and scowled behind a red beard and thick caterpillar eyebrows. Tufts of fiery hair poked out from under his woolen hat. "What took you so long, Bungalow?" he snarled. "You're late." Another man walked hesitantly down Splendid Road towards the Emporium. He was a little smaller than Fist, but just as square. Dressed in navy again, but without a hat, his bald head reflected the rising sun. Bungalow's face was softer and a little more vacant. He seemed weighed down by a strange machine that was strapped tightly to his back. He carried a leather notebook under his arm and shook his head from side to side as he handed it over. "What do you mean, no show?" Fisk roared, staring at an open page. "I'm sorry, Fisk, she just wasn't there. I waited for hours." "Of course she was there. She lives there. You know what the brothers will say when they hear about this. She's top of the list. Get your thick head around that. She needs hollowing." "Hollowing? What was hollowing?" Violet looked at Boy wide-eyed. "I know, but I swear she wasn't there. I couldn't do anything about it. I got her mother, though. Please don't tell on me," Bungalow pleaded. "Give me the hollower. If you want a job done right, you have to do it yourself," Fisk said, grabbing the weighty backpack. "But it's almost daylight." "Shut up and go log in at the tower. I don't give a care what time it is. I'll get her, and then we'll see what the brothers have to say about this." Fisk growled as he strode away from the Emporium along Splendid Road. They waited for a few minutes as Bungalow headed off towards the center of town. Then Boy turned to Violet. "Come on, quickly," he whispered. "Just stay back a little out of his way." They slipped down Edward Street onto Splendid Road, a short distance behind Fisk's. Violet crossed her fingers and hoped that the watcher would go into some other house along the way. He didn't, and her suspicions were confirmed when he turned the corner at the bottom of the road and continued along the tree-lined avenue. "I think he's going to your house, Violet," Boy said, looking straight at her. "I'll cause a diversion. You have to get back inside and act as normal as you can. Don't forget to put on your old glasses, the perfect ones. Then if Fisk does pay you a visit, you won't notice a thing." "But what if I see him by accident?" "You won't," Boy said urgently. "The perfect glasses do the same to the watchers as they do to me. He'll be invisible, trust me." "But why is he going to my house? I don't like any of this." Violet panicked. "What does he want?" "I don't know, Violet. We don't have time. Just do it," Boy replied sharply, sprinting ahead. They were just around the corner from Violet's house when they spotted Fisk walking up the driveway. The two of them jumped over the low wall that surrounded the house and followed him as quietly as they could, hiding under the cover of the trees that edged the gravel yard. "Right, go now," Boy whispered, pushing Violet towards the house. As she sprinted for the steps, Boy raced towards Fisk. A painful cry echoed behind her, but she didn't dare look back. Her legs were on fire and her chest heaved as she sucked in the early morning air. She cut across the gravel up to the door and scrambled for the key her mother left under the potted plant. She was shaking so much she couldn't fit it in the lock. There was another cry behind her. She let out an accidental squeal as the key slid into the lock and turned. The door opened and she flew into the hallway, closing it gently behind her. Resting her back against the wood, she stopped to catch her breath. Suddenly, she heard the lock in the door click once more. She raced into the kitchen and opened the fridge, pretending to search for something. There were footsteps behind her. She froze. All the air flew from her lungs. Act normal. She picked up the milk as calmly as possible, closed the fridge, and turned to walk back towards the table. Fisk stood right there, his black eyes boring into hers. Her heart thumped loudly. The glasses! She'd forgotten to swap the glasses! Looking straight ahead, she walked towards the table. He was in her way, but she couldn't veer around him. Keeping course, she prayed he would move. A step away from a crash, Fisk slipped aside, his eyes still firmly fixed on Violet. She breathed a silent sigh of relief as she sat down and poured a bowl of cereal. Then she picked up the cereal box and pretended to study the back. It shivered in her grasp, and she quickly placed it back down. Her eyes continued to scan the words, not taking in a single one, as Fisk moved his face so close she could smell his stinking breath. He blew in her ear. She didn't flinch. He growled and stepped back as if remembering something, then left the room and headed upstairs. Violet released a breath as she listened for footsteps. Fisk was light on his feet, and it was difficult to tell which room he was in. A few moments later, he was back in the kitchen. He took a seat near the door and watched her. She acted normal, or at least as normal as she could, with her insides knotted. She cleared up her place, got out some school books, and stared blindly at the pages. After a while, Fisk grew impatient, and then, clearly frustrated, left the house. Violet waited a few minutes to make sure he was gone before running as fast as she could up the stairs and into her mother's room. Ma'am, are you all right?" she cried, shaking Rose awake. "Violet, for goodness sake, what time is it?" her mother slurred sleepily. "You're all right," Violet gasped, hugging her mom as tears slid down her cheeks. "Of course I'm all right, dear. Whatever has gotten into you?" "Nothing, ma'am. I had a bad dream." "You and your imagination," her mother smiled, rubbing her hair. "Are those new glasses, Pet?" "Oh, yeah, I got them from school. I'll make you breakfast, Violet said, suddenly remembering her specs. Back in her bedroom, she found her gold-rimmed glasses and put them on. Everything looked shiny again. Placing the wooden pair in their box, she shoved them into their hiding place in the mattress, put on her school uniform, and headed back downstairs to make her mom's breakfast. She yawned deeply as she poured the milk and imagined Mrs. Moody's breakdown if she fell asleep in class. She took off her glasses and listened for Boy. Nothing. Violet remembered all the things Boy had told her about the Watchers in No Man's Land. What was going on in Perfect? Why did the Watchers keep Boy and his friends locked up? And what were they looking for in her house? She shivered as she remembered Fisk's stare. She listened for Boy again, and still there was nothing. Where was he? Crossing her fingers, she hoped her new friend was okay. That's the end of chapter 13. Make sure to subscribe so you know when chapter 14 comes out. Bye-bye.